Great Chain of Being was an idea popular during the Elizabethan era that arranged all of creation, from the highest of beings to the lowest, in a hierarchical system. It was believed that each level of the chain was dependent on the level above it, and all of them were essential to the order of the universe. In Shakespeare's King Lear, this chain is tested and ultimately overthrown, leading to eventual chaos. The assault on the Great Chain of Being in King Lear is demonstrated through the disruption of the traditional hierarchy due to man being reduced to animalistic behavior, generational shifts, and the struggle for power between the characters. The Great Chain of Being places man at the top of the chain and animals below. In Joseph Boyden's 3-Day Road, the assault on the Great Chain is quite evident through the characters becoming something inhuman under the pressure of war. The main character, Elijah, after following his Anishinaabe belief of living in harmony with nature for his entire life, turns against it after being forced to kill to survive. Under great desperation, he turns into a Wendigo, an evil monster with a bloodthirsty desire to kill his victims. This disruption of the natural order caused many lives to be lost because of his displacement in the Great Chain of Being. This disruption was the result of Elijah's descent into violence without regard for his human nature. King Lear is the ruler of his kingdom, and after being exposed to the life of a peasant, he too becomes something like a Wendigo. Lear rips out the heart of his supposed daughter that was actually just a chicken, which truly signified his becoming a beast. King Lear stated, "I will do such things. What they are yet, I know not, but they shall be the tares of the earth." This statement clearly represents Lear's descent into an animalistic state of mind. At the beginning of the play, King Lear was covered in expensive clothing and was never spoken down to, just as a lion would, being the king of the jungle and wearing his magnificent coat of fur. No one would dare disrespect them, let alone hunt them. Nearing the end of the play, Lear's descent on the Great Chain was so significant, even he was being hunted to be killed. It's as if the king of the jungle became so weak that even he became prey to bison. In fact, the fool goes as far as to say a snail is better off than Lear right now because a snail has a home. It is demonstrated how power and authority control a human, because when the characters in the play King Lear are stripped of it, they are reduced to a state of animalistic behavior. I will preserve myself, and I am bethought to take the basest and most poorest shape that ever penury in the contempt of man brought near to beast. In Edgar's case, he purposefully reduces himself down the chain to someone who is considered of less worth than a sheep, a bedlam beggar, and disguises himself as the persona of Poor Tom. Poor Tom speaks in an incoherent manner, and for clothes, wears animal skins. Through these examples, it is demonstrated that humankind can be reduced to a state of wildness and savagery when faced with difficult circumstances. The fool says, "The hedge sparrow fed the cuckoo so long that it had its head bit off at young. So out went the candle, and we were left darkling." Lear is the hedge sparrow, and the daughters are the cuckoo. This, in King Lear, was the very root of all problems, carried and exaggerated by the butterfly effect. It began with Lear spoiling his children, resulting in them taking their gifted kingdoms for granted. The daughters came about a mindset of getting whatever they wanted, and it was due to these greedy desires which led to the downfall of the kingdom. The siblings are very much like baby hyenas. In the animal kingdom, when multiple hyenas are born, the majority of the time they will fight so that they can get more nourishment from their mother. In the first act, Regan and Goneril fake their love for King Lear, and utterly spit on their sister Cordelia after she loses her authority. The sisters fight for the nourishment that their father can provide them, and much like the cuckoo, have no use for him once they've been fed all that they can be fed. Edmund, having been fed with a silver spoon his entire life, grew a thirst for more wealth and recognition. Allow not nature more than nature needs. Man's life is cheap as beasts. Here, Lear explains that the only thing which separates man from animal is that humans need more than just the basics to live. They need self-esteem, valued possessions, fame, control, and so on. Lear and the others, having been stripped of such things, must perforce prey on itself, like monsters of the deep. In other words, they drag others down in their own selfish attempt to survive and thrive.
The Great Chain of Being is a hierarchy of beings that have separate purposes depending on where they are in that hierarchy. There is not one general hierarchy, but instead different types of hierarchies that fulfill different purposes. For example, the position in an animalistic hierarchy is often determined by survivability of each animal, whereas the position in an authoritative hierarchy is determined by the power which one has over others. Generational hierarchies, however, are often overlooked, but even the slightest generational shift can signify a change in the great chain of being. A case of this generational shift comes from Lear's retirement. This raises many problems, one being the way Lear splits his power by asking his daughters how much they love him. Lear does this because he expects them to still follow his command after he exchanges power, but when a father just gives his children full control over himself, they will take advantage of it. How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. Away, away! The context of this quote was Lear realizing that Goneril has betrayed him. This quote marks the beginning to Lear's descent into madness, as he notices his only daughters that his daughters only loved him for his power. Through Lear's foolish decision, Goneril and Regan notice a weakness in Lear's authority. By taking advantage of the opportunity, Goneril and Regan essentially become Lear's parents as they ordered him when the land was split. In addition to this, Lear's power on the great chain of being also fell as he no longer had power. The generational hierarchy is directly linked to the moral hierarchy through the fact that the two have the same ideas as to how they rank beings. Arthur Lovejoy, the author of the novel The Great Chain of Being, expands on this idea. Lovejoy explains that because emotions can provide strong evidence for the morality of a specific social target, setting off a moral emotion before the evaluation of a target should also influence the moral judgments of the target. This perfectly explains how Lear's predicament of a generational shift negatively affects greater chain of being, because it puts evil, which is the two daughters, above the righteous, which is Lear himself. It also shows us that Lear's decision to give land to his daughters based on how much they love him was due to his emotion, and how the amount of land given would have been based solely on how much he loved each one. By defying the great chain of being and the idea that it is based on a person's judgment, Lear creates this generational shift between himself and his daughters. When examining the impacts of generational shifts on the great chain of being, one must also examine the side plot of Gloucester and his family. This shift, however, was not the fault of his father's idiocracy as it was Lear's, in Lear's case, but was the doing of his bastard son Edmund. Edgar, Gloucester's legitimate son, was in the right to inherit according to the great chain of being. Edmund, jealous of the inheritance, made Gloucester believe that Edgar was a traitor by faking a letter, which stated how Edgar plots against him. Since Edmund tricked Gloucester, he gained influence over the family, tricking them into believing that he was truthful and that Edgar was the true bastard. By doing so, Edmund discredits Edgar and proves that he was unworthy of inheriting his father's land. This disrupts the great chain of being because inheritance of land back in Shakespearean era was based on two things: age, and more importantly in this case, is who the parent that owned the land liked more. By giving the land to Edmund, Gloucester breaks the great chain of being because he bases it off who he thinks will be more responsible with the inheritance, which, after believing in the fake letter, Edmund in Gloucester's eyes. Because he trusts Edmund over Edgar, Gloucester becomes just like Lear, as his illegitimate son gains full control over him. A prime example of this shown in modern media is shown throughout the show The Office. In the entirety of the show, Dwight Schrute, a worker in the office of Dunder Mifflin, desperately tries to gain the attention of Michael Scott, the manager of the office, so that he can become the next manager of Dunder Mifflin and rule the office with an iron fist. Michael, however, ignores him throughout the show and instead shows affection to Jim Halper, a very responsible and social worker amongst the other in the office, many times, and as goes as far as making Jim the manager for a couple of episodes as Michael was out of the office. Dwight had always noticed this affection Michael had towards Jim, so he would always try to ruin Jim's reputation to make himself look like the good guy. If Michael ever succumbed to Dwight's attempt to frame Jim and become manager, the rest of the employees and Michael himself would become powerless under Dwight's cruel rule over the office. Just as in Gloucester's case, this assaults the great chain of being because it brings power to someone that will take advantage of his new power without knowing how to use it, causing a generational shift to occur.
For the great chain of beings to function, all members of the chain must perform their respective responsibilities. However, as mentioned before, a man always desires. One of the major problems with the great chain of beings is the desire for authority. With the desire, characters are willing to do whatever it takes to fulfill it, which ultimately violates the great chain of beings and creates the condition for everyone's tragedy. The origin of this power struggle in King Lear can be traced back to Lear himself. At the start of the play, Lear wanted to retire. Given that the king never retires, this already foreshadows the storm which he will cause. To quote, "By his resignation of rule, Lear disrupts the harmonious order of nature, and the infinite good of God's order, which decrees that king rules for the good until God relieves him of his responsibility by death." Lear's initial crime makes these reparations felt both above and below, corrupting the entire scale of creation. The quote talks about a prominent idea of his time, that the king was put in his power by God. Through his resignation, Shakespeare already foreshadows Lear's tragedy, as he upsets nature with this action. In addition to his tragedy, Lear will also throw natural order out of the window as he displaces himself, since the lack of a king, a common indicator to God in Shakespeare's time, would mean chaos. This was immediately demonstrated through how he exchanges power arbitrarily, by asking his daughters to say how much they love him. This was the first spark towards the storm of power struggle. Through the lens of business Lexine, one could see how Lear views love as a representation of power and not as a family trait. Especially when Cordelia criticizes Lear and he replies with, quote, How, Cordelia, mend your speech a little, lest you may mar your fortunes." The context of this quote was that Cordelia spoke out about the foolishness of King Lear's decisions. However, Lear only seemed to worry that Cordelia's physical value has fallen due to the boldness of her words. Additionally, as seen in Act 1, Scene 1, line 54 to 76, the other two daughters, Goneril and Regan, already began to downplay each other's love for land. By his violation of the great chain of beings and his foolish definition of love, Lear creates the condition for the storm of power struggle, which will cause devastation to all characters. Being the first to violate the chain of beings when attempting to give up power, Lear's devastation came quickly. Right after he gave up power, Lear began to live in his daughter's place. Even though he no longer had power, Lear treated himself as if he was still king. This was proven wrong by Goneril and Regan, as they repeatedly violated Lear's authority, eventually stripping away what little authority Lear had left as a father. Since, quote, Father that wear rags do make their children blind, but father that bear bags shall see their children kind. Again, through the lens of business Lexine from this quote, since Lear viewed his family as power and authority rather than loved ones, he naturally received the same treatment back once he lost his kingship. To Goneril and Regan, Lear's position as a father and the former king was a threat to them, since it meant that Lear still has some authority which they did not gain. To solidify their newly obtained wealth, Lear must be eliminated from the storm of power struggle. However, it is important to note that Gunnar and Regan also violate the Great Chain of Beings through their power struggle against Lear, since not only were they challenging their father, they were also challenging a king appointed by God, despite Lear not having any actual power left. Naturally, Gunnar and Regan's tragedies would come as well. Before examining the downfall of the axis of evil, which includes most of the antagonists of the play, it is important to see how some characters took advantage of the chaotic hierarchy. Edmund, being one of the major antagonists, wanted to inherit Gloucester's fortune despite being an illegitimate son, which in Shakespeare's time was not possible. The way Edmund achieved this was to take advantage of the power struggle caused by Lear. Given that Gloucester never disobeyed the Great Chain of Being, as he was loyal to Lear and decently to his sons, Edmund Sykes was the one who did disobey the chain and quickly gained power. But then that power he was not supposed to have. His plots against Gloucester and his legitimate son, Edgar, were initially successful. However, it quickly fell apart as both Gloucester, at least temporarily, and Edgar did not violate the chain, which resulted in their survival. Edmund's devastation came when Edgar killed him in the end in a duel, eventually restoring the chain by taking the power back. Through the exchange of power, the axis of evil climbed up the Great Chain of Beings and broke the natural balance. However, after ensuring the downfall of Lear, it is impossible for the axis of evil to hold their power according to the Great Chain of Beings. They began to turn on each other as the top of the chain cannot be a multiple. Their power struggle eventually leads to their own devastation as Gunnar plots to kill Albany, which is a violation against the Great Chain of Being again, as the wife is technically below the husband in some ways. While Regan on the other side plots to kill Gunnar for Edmund. This is again another violation of the chain since the younger sister wants to take over the elder. In the end, their violation against the Great Chain of Being only led to their own devastation as Gunnar, Regan, Edmund, and Lear all died in their own plots. Well, in the end, the Great Chain of Being restores itself as Albany gives up power and hands it back to Edgar. The power struggle which led to the violation of the Great Chain of Beings can also be seen in the book World War Z by Max Brooks. The book talks about a fictional epidemic that turns humans into flesh-eating creatures. The virus itself is not too severe, but could potentially plunge the world into chaos if not cautious. Due to this, world governments seem to neglect the virus and rather put more focus into gaining more popularity and authority. For example, a drug company in the fictional United States claimed that they invented the vaccine. Through their campaign, millions of people paid for the vaccine, giving the company power and wealth that violates the Great Chain of Being, as the vaccine turned out to be fake. Similarly, when combating the growing threat of the infected, the army appears to focus more on showing off to gain popularity, despite the equipment being a heavy burden to actual combat. The government in this fictional universe can be compared to King Lear's axis of evil. During their process of infighting, they continuously violate the Great Chain of Beings. For World War Z, the tragedy that resulted from the negligence and struggle for power was the worst possible scenario that became real, with most of the world being overrun and casualties in the billions. Like Edgar in King Lear, the epidemic forcefully restores the chain of being by killing those who seek for power that they did not deserve and putting those who are responsible in the field.
The Great Chain of Being of the Elizabethan era was deeply embedded in society and has been mirrored in various ways throughout modern literature and media. In King Lear, it is demonstrated through the disruption of the traditional hierarchy due to man being reduced to animalistic behavior, generational shifts, and the struggle for power between the characters. To the people of that era, the Great Chain of Being must be maintained to avoid chaos. Sean Nee, a theoretical ecologist, defines the Great Chain as the universe is ordered in a linear sequence, starting from the inanimate world of rocks. Plants came next, then animals, men, angels, and finally God. Although the chains have existed for many years, it still is deeply embedded in society, and for this reason, we can gain the insight into our own lives and societies through the examination of how the Elizabethans understood and interacted with this concept. Thank you for your time.